What happens when the very man sworn to uphold the law becomes the most dangerous criminal in town? This is the story of André Stander, the South African cop who lived a double life and fooled an entire nation. André Charles Stander was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, on November 22, 1946. His birth carried weight because he wasn't just another child of post-war South Africa. He was born into a household of law, discipline, and authority. His father, Major General Frans Stander, was one of the most respected figures in the South African police force. For General Stander, the police uniform was sacred. It was a symbol of order in a country where chaos often brewed beneath the surface. From a young age, André was told what his future would be. His father didn't ask him what he wanted to be. He told him, "You will wear the badge. You will serve. You will uphold the law." It wasn't a choice. It was destiny, carved out by a man who saw no other path for his son. But even destiny has cracks. André's childhood was strict, almost militaristic. His father believed that toughness built character and softness was weakness. The young boy grew up learning that emotions had no place in a man's world. Mistakes were punished swiftly, and achievements were rarely celebrated. While other children played freely in the dusty streets of Johannesburg, André learned discipline. He polished his shoes until they shone. He memorized rules, regulations, and codes of conduct. His father wanted him molded, not nurtured. Yet behind that obedient exterior, something else was forming. A quiet rebellion, a sense of curiosity about life beyond rules and orders. By the time André was a teenager, that curiosity had turned into restlessness. In the mid-1960s, André entered the South African Police Academy. He was young, sharp, and ambitious. To most, he was destined for greatness. To him, it felt like a cage. André excelled in training. He was tactical, intelligent, and had a natural ability to read situations. He graduated near the top of his class, and his superiors saw him as a rising star. But inside, André was beginning to notice contradictions. South Africa was deep in the grip of apartheid. The police were not just fighting criminals. They were enforcing a system that oppressed millions. Every day, André watched colleagues carry out orders that blurred the line between justice and injustice. It gnawed at him. Was he really serving justice? Or was he just another pawn in a system designed to control? That dissatisfaction grew. And with it, a dangerous thought began to take shape. What if the criminals had it better? By the early 1970s, André was stationed in Johannesburg, the beating heart of South Africa's economy. The city was a paradox, glittering skyscrapers for the wealthy, sprawling townships for the poor, and crime everywhere in between. André noticed something striking. Criminals seemed freer than police. While officers drowned in paperwork, criminals lived fast, bold, and rich. They drove flashy cars, wore expensive clothes, and lived lives of indulgence while men like André worked for modest salaries, risking their lives with little reward. The temptation was irresistible. At first, it was curiosity. A test, could he really pull it off? He walked into a bank one morning with a disguise and a stolen revolver. His voice was calm, his movements deliberate. He ordered the teller to hand over cash. The terrified clerk obeyed, stuffing notes into a bag. André didn't panic. He didn't run. He walked out, cool as ice, got into his car, and drove away. Within hours, he was back at his desk at the police station. When news of the robbery came in, he even joined in the investigation, taking statements from witnesses who unknowingly described him. The thrill was unlike anything he had ever felt. The power, the rush, the secret. That first robbery didn't just give him money. It gave him a new identity. André's robberies became more frequent. He was careful, calculated, and precise. His insider knowledge of police procedure gave him an advantage no criminal could match. He knew patrol patterns, response times, and investigative blind spots. He never robbed recklessly. He planned each hit like a military operation. He often chose banks in busy districts, blending into the chaos of the city. His calm demeanor disarmed everyone. Witnesses later said he looked more like a businessman making a withdrawal than a dangerous criminal. Sometimes he took his audacity to new levels. He would rob a bank in the morning, then return later in uniform as an investigator. Imagine the irony, the man who stole the money also questioning the victims about how it happened. The newspapers began reporting about a phantom robber. The public was intrigued. Who was this mysterious man who struck with such confidence? André was living a double life. Officer Stander, the trusted policeman by day, phantom thief, the most elusive criminal by night. But no mask stays on forever. By the late 1970s, suspicions began to stir. André's colleagues noticed odd coincidences. Why was he always nearby when a robbery occurred? Why did his reports contain such unusual accuracy? Still, the thought that one of their own, the son of a police general, could be the robber seemed absurd. The police hunted shadows while the real criminal sat right under their noses. André, however, was losing his restraint. What began as a test had turned into an addiction. Each successful heist emboldened him. He robbed not just for money but for the thrill. His double life was teetering on the edge, and it was only a matter of time before the perfect game cracked. The police believed they were chasing a ghost. What they didn't know was that the ghost was one of their own, laughing in their faces, shaking their hands, and wearing the same uniform. But soon, the truth would come crashing down, and André Stander's secret life would unravel. For years he fooled the police, until one mistake turned the hunter into the hunted. André Stander thought he had perfected the art of deception. For years he had lived a double life, the respected officer by day and the phantom bank robber by night. He had become a master at walking both sides of the law. But in Johannesburg, secrets have a way of spilling. By the late 1970s, the phantom robber was front-page news. South Africa's newspapers ran headlines about the mysterious man who struck banks with precision, often in broad daylight. Witnesses described him as calm, confident, even polite, a gentleman robber. The police were humiliated. How could such a criminal slip through their fingers again and again? André laughed quietly as his colleagues struggled to find answers. Each time they drew up new strategies, he was already 2 steps ahead. After all, he knew exactly how they thought. But arrogance is a dangerous companion. The more successful he became, the more careless he grew. The Johannesburg police force was under pressure. Every week, another robbery made headlines. Business owners were furious, banks were losing millions, and citizens demanded answers. Internal meetings grew heated. The robber's style suggested military precision, almost as if he had police training. André's own father, General Franz Stander, was part of these high-level discussions. He demanded accountability, insisting that the police force had to restore its honor. All the while, his son, the very man behind the crime, sat silently, nodding in agreement. But cracks were beginning to show. Investigators began noticing odd coincidences. André often seemed to be nearby when robberies happened. His case files contained an uncanny amount of detail, as though he had been in the room. He brushed off the suspicion with charm and wit, but whispers spread. One detective reportedly joked, "Sometimes I think André knows the robber personally." No one laughed. For years, André had thrived on his ability to vanish without leaving a trace. But greed and overconfidence led to a critical mistake. One morning, he robbed a bank in Johannesburg wearing a false beard and glasses. The heist went smoothly, but as he fled, witnesses caught a clearer look at him than usual. His posture, his walk, even his eyes seemed oddly familiar. Later, when the police gathered descriptions, one name kept surfacing. He looked like that policeman Stander. The department initially dismissed the claims. The idea was absurd. A decorated officer? The son of a police general? Impossible, but the seed had been planted. Investigators quietly began watching him. They monitored his movements, checked his finances, and asked subtle questions. What they discovered was damning. Despite his modest police salary, André was living well beyond his means. Lavish parties, expensive clothes, and a lifestyle no ordinary officer could afford. The evidence mounted. The phantom robber was no longer a ghost.
He had a name.
In 1980, the facade finally shattered. A sting operation was set up, carefully designed to catch him in the act. On one of his jobs, the police cornered him. For once, André's confidence couldn't save him. He was arrested and dragged away, no longer Officer Stander, but Suspect Stander. The revelation shook South Africa. The public was stunned. Newspapers ran headlines in disbelief. Policeman behind string of bank robberies. For citizens who trusted the police to protect them, it felt like betrayal. For the police force, it was humiliation of the highest order. Most devastated of all was his father, General Franz Stander, the man who had built his life on Honor now faced the shame of seeing his own son branded a criminal. It wasn't just a scandal, it was personal disgrace. The trial was a media circus. Courtrooms were packed with journalists, curious citizens, and bank employees who had been his victims. The prosecution painted him as a dangerous criminal who had exploited his position of trust. The defense tried to argue that André was a man trapped in a corrupt system, lashing out against injustice. But the facts spoke louder than any argument. Witnesses identified him. Financial records exposed his unexplained wealth. Even some of his colleagues testified against him. The verdict was inevitable: guilty on multiple counts of bank robbery. The sentence was harsh, 17 years in prison. As he stood in the courtroom listening to the judge, André's face betrayed little emotion, but inside anger boiled. He didn't see himself as a common criminal. He saw himself as smarter than the system, betrayed only by a moment of bad luck, and he was already thinking ahead. Prison would not be his end. It would be the beginning of something bigger. André was sent to Zonderwater Prison, one of South Africa's toughest facilities. For most men, prison was the end of freedom, the end of ambition. But for André, it was an opportunity. Inside the grim walls of Zonderwater, André found himself surrounded by men like him: robbers, gangsters, outlaws. Among them were two men who would change his life forever: Alan Hale and Lee McCall. Hale was a career criminal, sharp and resourceful. McCall was reckless, wild, and fearless. Together, the three men bonded over shared resentment of the system and dreams of escaping it. It was in the prison yard, during whispered conversations and careful planning, that the seed of the Stander gang was born. Meanwhile, outside prison, the public fascination with André grew. Some saw him as a villain, a traitor to his badge. But others saw something different: a folk hero. He had robbed banks, not ordinary people. He had embarrassed the police, an institution many South Africans distrusted under apartheid. To some, André was more than a criminal. He was a symbol of rebellion. That dangerous myth began to spread, and with it, André's legend grew even behind bars. André Stander, once the golden boy of the South African police, was now prisoner Stander, locked away, disgraced and stripped of his badge. But inside those prison walls, a new plan was taking shape. And soon the world would learn that André's story was far from over. Locked away for 17 years, he was supposed to disappear. But instead, André Stander turned prison into the birthplace of his greatest crime spree. In 1980, after being convicted of multiple bank robberies, André Stander was sentenced to 17 years in Zonderwater Prison, a massive correctional facility in Cullinan, east of Pretoria. For the South African public, the sentence felt like justice served. The policeman turned robber would finally pay for his betrayal. But for André, prison wasn't an ending. It was merely another stage in his transformation. Zonderwater was notorious when overcrowded, filled with hardened criminals, gang leaders, and men who had nothing left to lose. The prison's gray walls carried the weight of despair. But for André, the man with the restless spirit, those walls became a canvas for plotting. He entered prison as a disgraced policeman, but he refused to remain one. He studied his environment, learned the routines, and observed the weaknesses of the guards. Every day was reconnaissance. Prison has a way of bringing unlikely men together. In Zonderwater, André crossed paths with two fellow inmates who would change his destiny: Lee McCall and Alan Hale. Lee McCall was the kind of man who thrived on chaos. A career criminal with a violent streak, he was reckless but daring. He had little patience for rules and often clashed with authority. To many, he was unpredictable, but to André, he was useful. Alan Hale, on the other hand, was strategic. Like André, he had a sharp mind and understood the mechanics of crime. He wasn't reckless like McCall. Instead, he was measured, thoughtful, and calculating. The three men formed a bond built on shared hatred of the system and a desire for freedom. They began discussing escape not just as fantasy, but as a tangible plan. In the bleak prison yard, whispers turned into blueprints. The idea was simple but audacious: escape, regroup, and unleash a reign of robberies unlike anything South Africa had seen before. Unlike many prisoners, André had a unique advantage: charisma. He had always been persuasive, able to charm colleagues, suspects, and even judges. In prison, he used this gift to his benefit. He befriended guards, gaining small privileges. He played the role of the cooperative inmate, never causing trouble, always appearing compliant. To the prison authorities, he seemed rehabilitated. To his fellow inmates, he was quietly building influence. This dual identity was the same trick that had allowed him to rob banks as a policeman, and now it was helping him prepare for his greatest act, escape. By 1983, André had been behind bars for 3 years. To most, that was the end of the story. But in his mind, it was only the beginning. The plan was bold. While many prisoners dream of elaborate breakouts, André's strategy was surprisingly simple. Use charm, opportunity, and timing. He exploited weaknesses in the prison security system. He noticed that the guards were predictable. Shifts rotated with military regularity, and certain areas of the prison were left unguarded for short stretches. More importantly, André realized that complacency had set in. No one truly believed a former policeman would attempt something so daring. The plan was set. During a prison outing to the library, André would overpower a guard, seize a weapon, and make a break for it. Timing and precision would be everything. In August 1983, the opportunity came. During a scheduled prison visit, André executed his plan. With swift precision, he overpowered a guard, grabbed his pistol, and turned the ordinary day into chaos. Prisoners shouted. Guards scrambled. But André moved with the calm of a man who had rehearsed every step in his mind. Within minutes, he slipped past the gates, leaving chaos behind. The impossible had happened. The infamous policeman turned bank robber had now become a fugitive. His escape electrified South Africa. Newspapers screamed headlines, "Stander escapes." Citizens who once saw him as disgraced now saw him as legendary. For some, he was a criminal. For others, he was a folk hero who had humiliated the system again. After his escape, André didn't vanish into hiding. Instead, he went looking for his prison allies. Soon, Lee McCall and Alan Hale also broke free, aided by the chaos André had ignited. Together, they formed what would become known as the Stander Gang. Unlike ordinary criminals, they weren't content with lying low. They wanted to make a statement. They wanted wealth, notoriety, and freedom. And they would take it all by force. For André, the jailbreak marked a turning point. He was no longer just a cop-turned-robber. He was now a full-fledged outlaw, celebrated in some circles, hunted in others. The gang spent their early days regrouping, gathering weapons, and planning. Each man brought something unique to the table. Stander's intelligence and police knowledge, McCall's daring fearlessness, Hale's sharp strategy. Together, they would become South Africa's most infamous criminal trio. The escape turned André into a myth. To the public, he was no longer just a disgraced officer. He was a man who had outsmarted the system twice, once as a phantom robber, and now as an escaped prisoner. For many South Africans living under apartheid, where trust in the police was already fractured, André became something larger than life. He wasn't seen as robbing them, he was robbing the establishment, the banks, the system itself. Of course, this was romanticized. In reality, he was a criminal. But myths don't care about reality, and André's myth was growing fast. But freedom came with consequences. The police were embarrassed, furious, and determined to restore their reputation. The manhunt intensified. The state poured resources into tracking him down. André knew time was limited. The gang had to act fast. If they were going to live free, they would need money. A lot of it. And for that, there was only one option: banks. The Stander gang was about to begin their reign. From disgraced officer to daring escapee, André Stander was no longer just a man, he was a legend in the making. But legends burn bright and legends burn fast. His prison break wasn't the end of his story. It was the spark that would ignite one of the most notorious crime sprees South Africa had ever seen. They had escaped prison, humiliated the police, and were free men once again. But freedom came with a price, and for André Stander and his new gang, survival meant turning South Africa's cities into hunting grounds. When André Stander broke out of Zonderwater prison in 1983, he didn't run alone for long. His charm and leadership had drawn 2 other men into his orbit. Lee McCall and Alan Hale. Together, the trio would go on to form one of South Africa's most notorious criminal groups, the Stander Gang. This was not a ragtag bunch of criminals. Each man brought something unique. André Stander, the mastermind, ex-policeman with intimate knowledge of police procedures, investigation tactics, and law enforcement psychology. He was disciplined, calculating, and charismatic. Lee McCall, the muscle, reckless, fearless, and unpredictable. McCall's daring nature made him invaluable in high-pressure situations, though his volatility would also be a liability. Alan Hale, the strategist, calm, intelligent, and detail-oriented. He was the gang's planner. the one who double-checked logistics and foresaw potential pitfalls. Together, they weren't just robbers, they were a criminal machine. After escaping, the men went underground. They moved between safe houses in Johannesburg, often using stolen cars and forged documents to stay ahead of the authorities. But hiding required resources, and resources required money. In their first days together, they robbed small businesses, testing their coordination as a team. These early crimes were practice runs, a way to refine roles, study their own reactions, and build trust in one another. Soon, however, the gang realized that small jobs wouldn't sustain them. They needed bigger payouts. And for that, there was only one target: banks. Stander insisted that their robberies follow certain rules principles he had developed during his solo career. 1. Speed, in and out within minutes. No lingering, no hesitation. 2. Disguise. Use wigs, fake beards, and stolen clothes to confuse eyewitnesses. 3. Rotation. Never hit the same area twice in a row. Always stay mobile, for minimal violence while they carried weapons. Stander discouraged unnecessary bloodshed. The goal was money, not murder. These rules, while not perfect, gave the gang an edge. Unlike reckless criminals, they acted with the precision of professionals. The gang's first significant heist together took place in late 1983. Their target, a suburban branch of Barclays Bank in Johannesburg. Stander entered the bank first, dressed in a wig and suit. With calm authority, he announced the robbery, brandishing his firearm. Behind him, McCall controlled the crowd, shouting at customers and staff to lie on the floor. Meanwhile, Hale managed the timing, keeping his eyes on the clock and directing Stander toward the vault. The robbery lasted less than 3 minutes. The gang made off with thousands of rand in cash. It was a success, clean, quick, and effective. The getaway car was switched twice to throw off police pursuit. By the time authorities arrived, the gang was gone without a trace. News of the heist spread quickly. It was bold, precise, and terrifying. But more importantly, it was a sign. The Stander gang was officially in business. With every robbery, their confidence grew. Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Durban banks fell victim. The gang struck with alarming regularity, sometimes hitting multiple banks in a single week. For the police, it was humiliating. They weren't just chasing criminals, they were chasing one of their own. Stander's insider knowledge made him nearly impossible to catch. He knew how patrols worked, how investigations were conducted, and how detectives thought. But while the gang celebrated their successes, cracks began to form beneath the surface. The partnership between Stander, McCall, and Hale was effective, but it wasn't always smooth. McCall was reckless, often drunk, and attracted attention. His volatility clashed with Stander's calculated leadership. Hale was cautious, sometimes too cautious, leading to disagreements about timing and risk. Stander, though respected as the leader, sometimes treated his partners as subordinates, which bred resentment. These tensions simmered quietly, even as the gang's fame grew. As the robberies piled up, so did the legend of André Stander. South Africans followed the news with fascination. Some saw him as a dangerous criminal. Others saw him as a Robin Hood-like figure, striking at banks and embarrassing a corrupt system. For many, there was a thrill in watching the police fail repeatedly. Newspapers gave him nicknames. Radio talk shows buzzed about his daring. He was no longer just a fugitive, he was becoming a folk hero. But while public fascination grew, the police pressure intensified. The South African police were desperate. The escape had embarrassed them, and the robberies only deepened the wound. Task forces were created, surveillance increased, and roadblocks set up. Stander's former colleagues were particularly enraged. To them, his actions weren't just criminal, they were personal betrayals. Yet despite the manhunt, the gang slipped through their fingers again and again. By early 1984, the gang had robbed over 30 banks, amassing millions in stolen cash. But success bred complacency. During one robbery in Durban, McCall's recklessness nearly exposed them. He fired a shot unnecessarily, causing panic and drawing more police attention than usual. For Stander, this was a warning sign. He realized their freedom was fragile. The longer they stayed in South Africa, the closer the net would tighten. It was time to think bigger. Stander began considering life beyond South Africa. Rumors circulated that he dreamed of moving to the United States or Europe, living as a free man with stolen wealth. But first, he needed more money, enough to vanish forever. And to get that, the gang had to keep robbing. This hunger for one last big payout would push them into even more dangerous territory. With each heist, the Stander gang grew bolder, richer, and more infamous. But inside the cracks were beginning to show. Their daring crimes captured the imagination of South Africa, but their growing arrogance and tension would soon set them on a collision course with fate. By the summer of 1983, banks across South Africa had only one name on their minds: the Stander gang. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were legends in motion, robbing banks in broad daylight, faster than the police could react. By late 1983, the Stander gang had become a force that South Africa could no longer ignore. Their robberies were not random crimes. They were coordinated, precise, and executed with chilling confidence. Bank employees began each day with dread. Customers glanced nervously at the doors, wondering if the infamous trio would burst in. For the police, every shift was a humiliation waiting to happen. But for André Stander, Lee McCall, and Alan Hale, this was their golden age. They were robbing more frequently, stealing more money, and becoming more infamous than ever before. In a span of just a few months, the gang robbed over 30 banks. Sometimes they would strike 2 in a single day. What set them apart wasn't just the scale, it was the style. They wore disguises, wigs, glasses, suits, construction uniforms. They carried themselves with confidence, walking into banks like businessmen rather than desperate criminals. Their heists rarely lasted more than 3 minutes. The sheer speed of the operations left victims stunned and police scrambling. By the time authorities responded to alarms, the gang was gone. Johannesburg bore the brunt of their spree. Banks in wealthy suburbs and city centers alike became targets. One robbery in Sandton was so daring that eyewitnesses later described Stander smiling at customers, assuring them no one would be harmed if they stayed calm. These small gestures, combined with his background as a former policeman, added to his reputation as a gentleman bandit. Meanwhile, McCall played the role of enforcer barking orders, waving his weapon and intimidating staff into compliance. Hale managed timing, ensuring the gang never exceeded their strict window. As the robberies increased, so did the public's obsession. Newspapers splashed headlines of the Stander gang strikes again. Radio shows debated whether Stander was a criminal mastermind or a folk hero. For some South Africans weary of the corruption and brutality of the apartheid regime, there was an almost guilty pleasure in watching the police fail. It was said that Stander represented rebellion, a man who defied the very system he had once served. To others, however, he was nothing but a dangerous traitor who had turned his back on his oath and his country. The South African police force was furious. Task forces were mobilized. Informants were paid. Roadblocks were set up daily. But Stander's insider knowledge gave him an edge. He knew how the police thought, how they planned, and how they responded. His understanding of procedures allowed the gang to stay one step ahead. Still, pressure mounted. Officers worked day and night. Politicians demanded results. The media mocked their incompetence. For Stander, this only heightened the thrill. With each heist, the gang amassed more wealth. Cash was divided, hidden, and sometimes squandered. McCall was reckless, spending money on cars, parties, and women. Hale tried to save, but even he indulged in luxuries. Stander himself lived extravagantly, driving fast cars and enjoying a lifestyle that drew suspicion. Their spending habits, while exhilarating, made them easier to track. Neighbors whispered. Friends grew suspicious. The circle of secrecy was tightening. By early 1984, their confidence was unshakable.
Eyewitnesses often described Stander as calm and even charismatic during robberies.
In one Pretoria bank, he reportedly apologized to a teller as he demanded money. In another, he cracked a joke while stuffing bundles of cash into a bag. These details fascinated the media and fueled the legend. People compared him to international criminals like Bonnie and Clyde, though with a South African twist. But this overconfidence was also dangerous. The gang began to take greater risks, pushing their luck. Despite their success, cracks were forming. McCall's recklessness, his drinking and erratic behavior often jeopardized their operations. He once nearly fired at a customer during a robbery, an action that horrified Stander. Stander's ego. He relished the fame, sometimes lingering too long in the spotlight. His arrogance made him careless. Hale's frustration. As the more level-headed member, Hale worried that their success couldn't last. He wanted them to slow down, but the others refused. The golden days were thrilling, but they carried the seeds of downfall. By now, every robbery was front-page news. The Stander gang wasn't just a police headache. They were a national obsession. Editorials debated what his crimes meant for South Africa. Some saw it as proof that the apartheid state was crumbling from within. Others saw it as evidence of moral decay in society. Stander himself seemed to enjoy the attention. To him, it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about notoriety. He wanted to be remembered. The height of the spree. Between late 1983 and early 1984, the gang reached their peak. At one point, they robbed 4 banks in just 5 days. Authorities later estimated that their total haul was worth millions in today's currency. But while the spree made them rich, it also made them the most wanted men in South Africa. The police, humiliated by months of failure, intensified their efforts. Surveillance was expanded. Known associates were questioned. Rewards were offered for information. Whispers of betrayal began to circulate in the underworld. Could someone within the gang's circle be feeding information to the police? Tensions rose. McCall accused Hale of being too cautious. Stander tried to keep the peace, but the cracks grew wider. The party couldn't last. As the spree continued, the gang began to run out of safe houses and hiding places. The police net was tightening. And then came the mistakes. McCall's reckless behavior drew attention in public. Stander's flashy lifestyle made him conspicuous. Hale worried constantly about being caught. The golden days were ending. For months, the Stander gang had robbed with impunity, living like kings while the police chased shadows. But behind the wealth, the headlines and the myth, cracks were forming that no amount of money could fix. The legend was growing, but so was the danger. And soon, their spree would spiral into violence, betrayal, and blood. They had millions in stolen cash, the fear of every bank in South Africa, and the admiration of the public. But behind closed doors, the Stander gang was tearing itself apart. For months, the Stander gang had lived like kings. Their spree of robberies seemed unstoppable. But while the world saw them as a united front inside the trio, tension simmered. The wealth they had amassed, the notoriety they enjoyed, and the pressure of being constantly hunted by police created fractures that no one could hide forever. André Stander was the leader, calm, calculated, and charismatic. But his ego was swelling. He relished the headlines, the whispers, and the legend that grew around his name. Lee McCall was the opposite, volatile, reckless, and increasingly unpredictable. His impulsive nature, once useful for intimidation, had become dangerous. And Alan Hale, the cautious strategist, found himself trapped between two extremes. He wanted discipline, planning, and restraint. But he was ignored more often than not. The gang's golden days were fading. Money had never been the problem. With millions of rands stolen, they were flush with cash. But money brought problems of its own. McCall spent recklessly, flashy cars, drugs, women. He was the kind of man who lived fast and loud. His spending habits drew attention, and whispers in the underworld began to spread. Stander, though less careless, also indulged. His taste for expensive clothes, cars, and nightlife made him conspicuous. He couldn't resist the thrill of flaunting his success. Hale, on the other hand, wanted to save and plan for the future. He argued that their fortune should be hidden, invested, and used wisely. His warnings were dismissed. Money divided them. It fed McCall's recklessness, Stander's ego, and Hale's frustration. As the Stander gang became infamous, the attention weighed heavily. Every robbery was front-page news. Every whispered rumor made them paranoid. Every friend, associate, or lover became a potential informant. For Stander, the fame was intoxicating. He had gone from being a bored policeman to South Africa's most notorious outlaw. He reveled in the attention. For McCall, fame meant more danger. His temper worsened under pressure. He became paranoid, quick to anger, and unpredictable. For Hale, fame was suffocating. He saw the headlines not as glory, but as a spotlight that would eventually burn them alive. The same fame that made them legends was tearing them apart. It started with small mistakes. During one robbery, McCall lost his temper and fired a warning shot into the ceiling. The unnecessary gunfire caused chaos and panic. Customers screamed and a silent alarm was triggered earlier than expected. Another time, Stander lingered too long in a bank, enjoying the control he held over the room. His arrogance slowed their escape by precious seconds. Hale protested, but his voice was drowned out. The gang was no longer the slick discipline machine they once were. Each mistake gave the police more clues, more opportunities. The South African police force, once humiliated, was regaining ground. The embarrassment of the escape and the spree had lit a fire under them. A dedicated task force tracked every lead. Safe houses were raided. Known associates were interrogated. Roadblocks increased. The pressure was relentless. The gang had fewer places to hide, fewer people they could trust. Inside the gang, paranoia grew. McCall accused Hale of being too cautious, maybe even disloyal. Hale accused McCall of being reckless, and Stander, caught between them, struggled to maintain control. The cracks widened. Trust, once the glue that held them together, was eroding. McCall suspected Hale of planning to leave the gang. He ranted that Hale might cut a deal with the police.
Hale, in turn,
accused McCall of being a liability, a man whose recklessness would get them all killed. Stander tried to mediate, but his focus was shifting. He was already dreaming of escape, of leaving South Africa for good, disappearing into another country with his share of the loot. Each man's vision of the future was different, and those differences became toxic. The gang often argued in their safe houses. Neighbors overheard shouting matches. Friends recalled the tension, McCall slamming doors, Hale pacing nervously, Stander staring silently into the distance. One night, a heated argument nearly turned violent. McCall, drunk and enraged, brandished his gun at Hale during an argument over money. Stander intervened, diffusing the moment, but the damage was done. The brotherhood was gone. What remained was mistrust. While the gang crumbled internally, Stander's ego only grew. He had become a media obsession. His name splashed across headlines, his face a symbol of defiance against authority. Friends recalled that he began to talk more about his legacy, about being remembered as South Africa's greatest outlaw. This obsession blinded him to the dangers. He underestimated the police, overestimated his control, and failed to see that his gang was falling apart. Hale saw the writing on the wall. He urged Stander to stop, to slow down, to plan an exit. But Stander brushed him off. He was too consumed by the thrill, the fame, and the money. Hale began to distance himself emotionally. He knew their spree couldn't last. McCall's decline was the most dramatic. His paranoia worsened. He drank heavily, partied recklessly, and became increasingly violent. Associates described him as a man on the edge, consumed by fear, anger, and suspicion. He talked of betrayal, of enemies everywhere, of the walls closing in. The once daring enforcer had become a liability. By early 1984, the gang was no longer united. They were three men moving in different directions. Stander, blinded by ego and dreaming of escape abroad. McCall, spiraling into paranoia and self-destruction. Hale, cautious and frustrated, watching the empire crumble. The cracks had become chasms, and soon those cracks would explode into open disaster. They had robbed banks with precision, humiliated the police, and lived like kings. But now the Stander gang was no longer a brotherhood, it was a time bomb. And when it finally exploded, blood would be spilled. And the legend would never be the same again. He was the muscle of the Stander gang, the man who shouted, intimidated, and scared crowds into submission. But Lee McCall's reckless nature would soon turn their empire of fear into blood and tragedy. By early 1984, the Stander gang was crumbling from within. For months, they had lived like outlaws, robbing banks with shocking regularity and taunting the police at every turn. But the cracks were widening, and at the center of it all was Lee McCall. McCall had always been the most volatile of the trio. His fearlessness, once a weapon, had now become recklessness. He drank heavily, partied wildly, and grew paranoid. Friends and associates described him as a man haunted by shadows, convinced the police were closing in, convinced betrayal was around every corner. Stander and Hale knew McCall was unstable, but no one realized how quickly his paranoia would spiral into chaos. The South African police were no longer stumbling in the dark. They had mapped out possible safe houses, gathered intelligence on the gang's movements, and tracked suspicious spending. McCall's recklessness made him the easiest to follow. His noisy lifestyle, his flashy cars, and his constant presence in bars and clubs drew attention. Where Stander was careful and Hale cautious, McCall lived like there was no tomorrow. And it was this recklessness that would give the police their first real opening. In February 1984, the gang was hiding out in a suburban house in Hurlingham, a wealthy district of Johannesburg. The house, rented under false identities, was meant to be a temporary refuge. But neighbors had grown suspicious. Strange cars came and went at odd hours. Young men with money but no jobs drew unwanted attention. Police surveillance eventually confirmed what they had suspected. The Stander gang was hiding inside. The trap was set. Inside the Hurlingham house, the tension was unbearable. Stander was restless, already dreaming of escape abroad. Hale was cautious, urging them to leave before the police closed in. McCall was volatile, drinking heavily and ranting about betrayal. Arguments were frequent. McCall accused Hale of wanting out. Hale accused McCall of being reckless. Stander tried to play mediator, but his patience was wearing thin. The atmosphere was combustible, and everyone knew it couldn't last. On the morning of February 14, 1984, police made their move. Acting on intelligence, heavily armed officers surrounded the Hurlingham safe house. They knew McCall was inside, but Stander and Hale were elsewhere at the time. For the police, this was their moment of redemption. For months, they had been humiliated. Now they had one of the gang cornered. McCall woke up to the sound of boots and gunfire. The house was surrounded. Officers shouted for him to surrender. But surrender was never in McCall's nature. He grabbed his rifle, loaded ammunition, and prepared for war. Neighbors recalled hearing shouts, then gunfire. Smoke filled the air as bullets tore through the house. McCall fired wildly, refusing to give up. The standoff raged for hours. Police poured fire into the house. McCall responded with equal ferocity, screaming defiance. For those watching, it was a surreal scene, one man against an army of police, refusing to back down. The end came violently. As smoke filled the rooms and the walls buckled under gunfire, McCall made one last stand. Firing through windows, shouting curses, he fought until his ammunition was nearly gone. Then in a storm of bullets, McCall was struck down. The gunfire stopped. Silence fell over Hurlingham. When police entered the ruined house, they found McCall's body amid broken furniture and shattered glass. His defiance had ended in death. For the police, it was a victory, proof that the Stander gang could bleed. For Stander and Hale, it was the beginning of the end. News of McCall's death spread like wildfire. Newspapers splashed the story across front pages. Radio stations buzzed with details of the siege. Some called McCall a madman who got what he deserved. Others saw him as a tragic figure, consumed by paranoia and hunted by a system that would never forgive him. For Stander, the loss was personal. McCall had been reckless, but he was also loyal. His death left a hole in the gang, and a chilling realization. They were running out of time. Hale, ever the pragmatist, saw McCall's death as inevitable. He had warned that recklessness would destroy them. Now, with one member gone, he knew their days as a gang were numbered. Witnesses later recalled that Stander was shaken by McCall's death. He spoke less, grew more distant, and seemed haunted by the reality of their crumbling empire. But even in grief, he couldn't resist the pull of his ego. Rather than disappear, he continued to dream of a new life abroad, a final escape that would allow him to outrun his past. For Hale, McCall's death hardened his resolve. He began making his own plans, thinking of survival rather than loyalty. He loved the thrill of the heists, but he knew the end was coming. The gang was no longer a brotherhood. It was a sinking ship. The siege at Hurlingham wasn't just the death of McCall. It was the death of the illusion that the Stander gang was untouchable. For months they had seemed invincible, robbing with impunity, embarrassing the police. But now the public saw their vulnerability. The myth had cracks. Let's take action and embrace inner peace. Achieving inner peace is a personal and unique journey. Here are some general approaches that might be helpful. 1. Meditate regularly. Meditation encourages a clear mind and calm spirit, allowing you to disconnect from worldly concerns and focus on your inner self. Chores maintain physical health. Regular exercise, a healthy diet, and good sleep habits can significantly improve your mental state. 3. Spend time in nature. Whether it's a walk in the park, stargazing, or listening to the ocean, spending time in nature can effectively help you achieve peace. Let's take action and embrace inner peace. And the police, emboldened by their first real victory, redoubled their efforts to catch the remaining 2. Even in death, McCall's story fueled the legend of the gang. Some admired his refusal to surrender, calling it bravery. Others dismissed it as stupidity. But for South Africa, the message was clear. The end of the Stander gang was approaching. The death of Lee McCall was more than the fall of one man. It was the first domino. The legend of the Stander gang had been shaken, and soon, the empire they built would collapse in blood and betrayal. For André Stander, the clock was ticking. After McCall's bloody death, the world knew the Stander gang was collapsing. But André Stander wasn't ready to surrender. Instead, he dreamed of a bold new life in America, a dream that would cost him everything. The year was 1984, and the Stander gang was no longer the three-headed monster that had terrified South Africa. Lee McCall's death in a hail of gunfire had shocked the country and reminded the world that even the boldest criminals could fall. But for André Stander, the leader and mastermind, the story wasn't over. If anything, McCall's death made him more determined than ever. Where McCall had been reckless, Stander prided himself on being calculating. He believed he could still escape the tightening net of the police, still outwit the system that had once trusted him as one of their own. The question was no longer whether he could keep the gang alive. It was whether he could build a new life somewhere far away. And for Stander, that place was America. Stander's obsession with America went back years. Hollywood movies, stories of outlaws, and the allure of anonymity in sprawling cities fascinated him. To Stander, America represented both freedom and reinvention. In South Africa, he was hunted, his face splashed across newspapers. But in the United States, he believed he could vanish into the crowd, live under a new name, and perhaps even enjoy his stolen riches in peace. It was a fantasy born out of desperation, but one he was determined to make real. With Hale still around but growing more cautious, Stander began making quiet preparations. False passports using contacts in the underworld. He secured forged travel documents. These would allow him to cross borders without raising suspicion. Cash reserves from previous heists. He stashed money in secret locations, carefully planning how much to carry abroad. Connections abroad. Rumors suggest he contacted acquaintances in the United States, hoping to build a network that could shelter him. But every plan carried a risk. Police surveillance was increasing, and after McCall's death, the gang's every move was under scrutiny. Still, Stander believed his charm, intelligence, and adaptability would be enough to outsmart them. Alan Hale, the last surviving member of the trio, saw things differently. To Hale, the fantasy of running away to America was just that, a fantasy. He wanted out, yes, but he also understood that the world was shrinking for them. Escaping South Africa didn't mean escaping justice forever. Hale began considering his own options. Loyalty was fading and survival became the priority. The partnership that had once been bound by greed and adrenaline was now cracking under fear and mistrust. One of the most daring moments came when Stander managed to leave South Africa through Johannesburg's Jan Smuts Airport, right under the noses of authorities who were hunting him. Disguised and using forged documents, he boarded a flight to the United States. It was a gamble of epic proportions, and it worked. For the first time in months, Stander breathed freely. Behind him was the chaos of Johannesburg, the ruins of McCall's death, the betrayal of his badge as a policeman. Ahead of him lay Miami, Florida, a city where he believed he could reinvent himself. In Miami, Stander tried to create a new identity. He rented apartments under false names. He bought flashy cars, unable to resist the lure of his old life. He mingled in bars and clubs, charming strangers with his wit and charisma. But while he wanted to disappear, Stander also couldn't help but be Stander, bold, flamboyant, and reckless in small ways. To the outside world, he was just another foreigner living large in Miami. But the South African authorities had already tipped off the FBI and American police. His days of freedom were numbered. For a few brief weeks, Stander lived the life he had always imagined. Sun-soaked beaches, endless nightlife, and the illusion of anonymity. But beneath the surface, cracks appeared. He struggled with money. His paranoia returned. He knew that if he made one mistake, one slip, the police would catch him. Ironically, it was his love of cars that betrayed him. In Miami, Stander visited a car dealership and bought a flashy Ford Mustang. But when staff grew suspicious of his payment methods, they alerted the police. Authorities ran his details and realized who he was, the infamous South African fugitive. The manhunt began. American police began quietly tracking Stander's movements. He was followed, watched, and studied. Meanwhile, back in South Africa, the news spread. Stander had resurfaced in the United States. Newspapers once again blared his name, this time as an international fugitive. To some, it was thrilling. Their outlaw had outsmarted the world. To others, it was pathetic, a man running out of places to hide. On February 13, 1984, Stander's dream of a new life came to a brutal end. Police tracked him to a small apartment in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Acting on reports, officers surrounded the area, waiting for him to make a move. That morning, Stander left his apartment and got into his car, but officers closed in. He tried to fight back. Reports suggest he reached for a weapon, but it was too late. Police opened fire. André Stander, once a respected police officer and later South Africa's most notorious outlaw, was gunned down in a Florida parking lot. News of Stander's death sent shockwaves back home. For some, it was the end of a criminal who had embarrassed the police. For others, it was the tragic fall of a man who had dared to rebel against authority. To the public, his death marked the closing chapter of one of the wildest stories in South African history. For Alan Hale, it was confirmation that survival was now a solo mission. Even in death, Stander's story refused to die. His audacity, his charisma, and his betrayal of the system made him a figure of fascination. Books, documentaries, and even films would later explore his life. He became both villain and anti-hero, a man remembered as much for his flaws as for his daring. André Stander thought he could outrun South Africa. He thought he could reinvent himself in the land of dreams. But in the end, his greatest gamble was also his greatest mistake. A fatal leap that ended not in freedom, but in a Florida parking lot. The Stander gang was shattered. McCall was dead. Stander was gunned down in America. But one man remained. Alan Hale, the last outlaw hunted across continents. The year was 1984, and the once feared Stander gang was no more. Lee McCall was buried after a reckless standoff with police. André Stander, the mastermind, had been killed in a Fort Lauderdale parking lot, ending his dream of escaping into America. That left Alan Hale, the quiet strategist of the group, the man who had never craved the spotlight, but whose fingerprints were all over the gang's exploits. For Hale, survival now depended on disappearing into the shadows. Hale knew he had two options. One, flee abroad, using the same networks and forged documents that had carried Stander to America. Two, go underground in South Africa, hoping to blend into ordinary society. Both choices were dangerous. The police were desperate to salvage their reputation after years of humiliation. Public anger was boiling. They wanted blood, or at least justice. Hale also carried the weight of betrayal. With Stander gone, there was no shield of charisma to protect him. The myth of the gentleman robber was shattered. Now he was simply another criminal on the run. Hale chose to run. Using forged papers, he fled South Africa and began a life as an international fugitive. Hale chose to run. Using forged papers, he fled South Africa and began a life as an international fugitive. He drifted through Europe and the United Kingdom, moving constantly, never staying long in one place. For a while it worked. He blended into foreign cities, working odd jobs under false names. In some places, he even regaled strangers with sanitized versions of his adventures, carefully leaving out the blood, the betrayal, and the pain. But deep down, Hale knew his past was chasing him. Living as a fugitive wasn't glamorous. Constant paranoia. Every siren made his heart race. Every police officer on the street seemed to glance at him too long. Loneliness. With McCall and Stander gone, Hale had no allies, no friends. His life became one of isolation. Financial strain. The stolen money never lasted. Without a steady income, he struggled to maintain the illusion of stability. At times, he thought of turning himself in. But the fear of South African prisons kept him running. In the mid-1980s, Hale's luck finally ran out. Working under an alias in the United Kingdom, he attracted suspicion during a routine investigation. His false documents didn't hold up under scrutiny. Before long, British authorities realized they had captured one of South Africa's most wanted men. The arrest made headlines in both the UK and South Africa. The last man of the Stander gang was finally in custody. Hale was extradited back to South Africa to face justice. The trial of Alan Hale didn't carry the same glamour or circus-like atmosphere as Stander's. The world had already moved on, and the myth of the gang was fading. But for Hale, it was the moment of reckoning. The prosecution laid out his role in the gang, the planning, the robberies, the collaboration with Stander and McCall. The charges were overwhelming. Hale, unlike Stander, didn't carry himself with arrogance. He was subdued, weary, almost resigned. He knew what was coming. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Prison for Hale was not an escape, but it was a strange kind of relief. The running was over. In prison, he began to reflect. Unlike Stander, who had clung to defiance until his last breath, Hale seemed to accept his fate. Over the years, he developed a reputation as an inmate who had turned inward, often speaking about regret and the price of choices. He began giving talks to fellow prisoners, warning them against the lure of crime, whether out of genuine remorse or simply the wisdom of survival. Hale's persona shifted. By the time Hale was behind bars, public opinion of the gang had changed. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Stander's audacity had turned him into a folk hero for some, a man who embarrassed the police under apartheid. But with the bloodshed, betrayals and global manhunts, the romance of the story had faded. To many South Africans, Hale was simply a criminal who had squandered his life chasing thrills, and yet curiosity lingered. People wanted to know what it was like inside the gang. How had a police officer, a reckless outlaw, and a quiet strategist joined forces to terrorize the country? Hale became the last living witness. In the 2000s, after serving more than 2 decades, Hale was released from prison. Unlike Stander, he lived to see old age. He spent much of his later life speaking publicly about his past. Schools, rehabilitation programs, and journalists sought him out. Hale gave interviews in which he described the gang's rise and fall. He admitted his role but often framed it as a cautionary tale. One of his most striking reflections was that, unlike Stander, he had no illusions of being a hero. To him, it had all been greed, adrenaline, and foolishness. But survival came with its own burden. Hale lived with the memory of 2 dead partners, one killed in South Africa, the other in America. He lived with the weight of betrayal, of choices that had destroyed not only his life but also those of countless victims, and perhaps most painfully, he lived with the knowledge that history would always remember him not as Alan, Hale the man, but as Alan Hale of the Stander Gang. The Stander Gang ended in bullets, betrayal, and blood. But Alan Hale carried the story into old age, the last man standing, the one who lived long enough to tell the world how greed, arrogance, and violence destroyed them all. Decades after their fall, the Stander Gang remains one of South Africa's most infamous legends. Were they outlaws rebelling against a broken system, or criminals who destroyed lives chasing greed? By 1984, the Stander Gang was gone. Lee McCall lay buried after his reckless showdown with police. André Stander had been gunned down thousands of miles from home. In a Florida parking lot, Alan Hale, the last survivor, sat in prison, staring at decades behind bars. For law enforcement, it was both relief and humiliation. Relief that the nightmare was finally over. Humiliation that one of their own had led it all. But for the public, the gang story was far from finished. Even in the 1980s, South Africans argued about what the Stander Gang represented. To some, they were nothing but criminals. They robbed banks, terrified employees, and shattered the trust between citizens and police. To others, they symbolized rebellion against a corrupt system. During apartheid, many South Africans, and especially black South Africans, distrusted the police, who were often instruments of state repression. To them, seeing a policeman humiliate his own institution felt like poetic justice. This duality created a strange cultural legacy, the Stander Gang, as both villains and folk heroes. For the South African police force, the scandal was lasting. How could a respected officer, the son of a police general, carry out dozens of robberies under their noses? André Stander's betrayal cut deeper than any criminal act. He had insider knowledge, training, and the trust of his colleagues, all of which he used against them. It wasn't just about stolen money. It was about broken trust. The force would spend years trying to rebuild its reputation. The families left behind. Often forgotten in the retelling are the victims. Bank employees traumatized by the robberies. Families who lived in fear of violence. Loved ones of the gang members forced to endure public shame. For them, the gang was not glamorous or legendary. It was pain, fear, and betrayal. André's own father, General Franz Stander, carried the deepest wound. A man of discipline and honor, he watched his son become the very thing he had sworn to fight against. For him, the legacy was not myth, it was heartbreak. As the years passed, the story of the Stander Gang grew larger than life. Books, documentaries, and eventually a 2003 Hollywood film, Stander, brought their saga to global audiences. The film portrayed André as a conflicted man, almost a Robin Hood figure rebelling against injustice. But this narrative clashed with reality. Yes, André was charismatic, and yes, he embarrassed the police. But he didn't rob to feed the poor or to fight apartheid. He robbed because he wanted thrills, money, and power. Still, myth often outshines truth. And in the myth, Stander became a symbol, a man too smart for the system, too daring to be ordinary. When Alan Hale was eventually released from prison in the 2000s, he became the last living voice of the gang. In interviews, he admitted their crimes but often painted them as a cautionary tale. He spoke of greed, poor choices, and the heavy price of crime. Hale's survival gave him something his partners never had, the chance to reflect. He often emphasized that while Stander had been painted as a hero, the truth was more complicated. Behind the charm and audacity was a man whose actions destroyed lives, including his own. Historians and criminologists have debated André Stander's motives for decades. Was he driven by greed? Was it boredom with police work, a craving for excitement? Or was it rebellion against the system he served? The most likely answer is a mix. Stander grew up privileged, became a policeman, and enjoyed authority. But beneath the uniform, he was restless. Crime gave him the adrenaline his job could not. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a thrill seeker who happened to be clever enough to outwit the system. For a while, the Stander gang left lessons that still resonate. 1. The danger of corruption within trusted institutions. When those sworn to protect the law break it, the damage is deeper than crime itself. 2. The seductive myth of the outlaw. Charisma and daring can make criminals seem like heroes, blinding society to their true impact. Or the inevitability of consequences. No matter how clever or daring, crime eventually collapses under its own weight. Why did the Stander gang capture the world's attention? Because their story combined all the elements of a Hollywood thriller. A cop turned criminal, daring robberies, escapes from prison, betrayal, death, and international manhunts. It wasn't just a South African story. It was a human story about power, temptation, and downfall. Today, nearly 4 decades later, the Stander gang remains etched in South African history. For some, it is a thrilling legend. For others, a painful reminder of betrayal. And for criminologists, a case study in psychology, corruption, and the fragility of trust. But one truth overshadows all the myths. Their empire of crime lasted only a few years. And in exchange for fleeting wealth and notoriety, they paid with their lives and freedom. The Stander gang promised themselves freedom, wealth, and immortality. Instead, they left behind graves, prison cells, and broken families. Their legend lives on, but as a warning, not as a dream.
This is Whispers in Africa. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the true crime documentary. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell icon, so you'll be notified when we upload a new video. You can also tell us what you think about this documentary in the comments section. I hope to see you in our next video. Bye.